Hello and welcome to part 3 of our 3-part series on using the Struts2 web framework with Apache Tomcat server. So in part 1, we were able to go out and get the files we needed for Struts2, and we deployed them into the library folder on our Tomcat container. That set us up to be able to work with Struts2. And then in part 2, we took the time to set up the build path, configure the web XML to add the filter for the Struts2 framework. And then we were able to move the struts XML file and modify that into our system, into the source folder, so that it's ready to go for all the directions that we need for our actions. So in this third part, what we're going to do is go ahead and set up the rest of the files to actually work with Struts2 and build out our login action so that we can have that actually integrated with Struts2. So once again, you'll want to have loaded World Manager with struts2.war, and of course, once you load that in, make sure you add in all the struts library jars into the build path, as well as the library for JUnit, to make sure that your project will compile and run. So assuming you've done that, let's take a look first at the things that we've changed for this project so that we can see how this is all set up for us. So first, I've added a file called scripts and css.jsp. Now what I've done here is essentially that block of code that exists on the head of all of our pages where we have the links for our style sheets and our scripts. I've basically put that into its own partial page here. So that way scripts and css.jsp can just be referenced and we'd only have to change it in one place. You can see here we're also just using the base URL to make sure that everything is referenced correctly no matter where we're at in the pages. The other thing I changed then is the nav bar. And in this version, the nav bar will also work with that base URL. But you'll note that now for some of these actions, we actually have mappings in place in our struts.xml file. If you remember back from the last lesson, we changed it so that home and login, sign out, and clear user data are just going to be mapped to those correct pages. And now we can see that those paths will actually work without having to type in the actual name of the page.jsp. You'll also note that I've left listcities.jsp, listcountries.jsp, and addcity.jsp under the protected directory directly referenced by file. Now we could go ahead and set that up in our actions in our struts.xml mappings, but the reason that I haven't done that for this project is because it messes with the theming a little bit and I didn't want to worry about taking the time to fix all of that. So it will still work, and it would work if we map them directly with their own routes, but the theming would be a little messed up. So I went ahead and left it this way. So the first thing that is the major change is going to be the login.jsp page. So before, if you remember when we built our login.jsp, we had a form, it pointed to an action, that action was a servlet. The servlet then handled some login stuff behind the scenes and redirected back to whatever page it needed to go to. Well, here what I've done is actually started to set this up to use struts. So the first thing, in order to use the struts tags, we have to have this prefix for our tag library for struts in place. So its prefix is S and its URI is just /struts tags. Now once we've done that, we can actually integrate the struts tags directly into our code on our JSP pages. The other thing about struts is that the tags come pre-formatted or pre-styled. And if you'd like to use the pre-styled versions, you need to have this tag at the top, sHead. In the header of the JSP file, we'll have this sHead, which will then allow all those styles and scripts to be applied, simply like we did with our scripts here when we imported our scripts and CSS files. This is essentially going to do the same thing for the struts styles, so that will all be in place. The other thing I've changed about this project is the way that the cookies are handled. It's surprisingly difficult to work with the cookies directly using struts because you have to use cookie interceptors, and it's a little bit beyond the scope of what I wanted to cover for our course. So what I've done is I've hacked together a little solution which works just fine. We're going to set some private fields on the page to the cookie values, and then we'll just reference those using jQuery. So you'll see those being pulled here and used by placing them into the UID and the password fields from those hidden fields that we'll have on our page. And so you'll see those here. I set them up as passwords, which if they were to be displayed would be all grayed out. But I've also set the display to none, so they won't actually show. But they are in the source behind the scenes, so it's something you may want to avoid doing, because again, it's not very elegant, but it does work. But for the purpose of our course, we're looking here now at the form here for our struts tag. So this is our first struts tag, and what we can see is that this struts tag does give us a form. And when we build that, we have an action, which is what we would expect, called login user. If you remember in the struts XML, we actually named an action login user. And by doing that, we've then mapped this now on our login page. And the method that we're going to call is execute. So when we call execute, that will run the execute code in the login user action code that we're going to build in a moment. So we're going to eliminate the use of an actual servlet by adding this action, which will do the things that we need it to do. Of course, we need to get the user's information for the user ID and password, but you'll note now that's all handled nicely with an S text field and an S password. We also have an S hidden field for the auth level, an S checkbox that we can use to remember our credentials, and an S submit tag. So you should be able to extrapolate what these are doing, but they're nicely styled so we don't have to use a table. We don't have to work with any of that. As long as we include that S head, everything will show up. And again, we can even implement our own classes on top using the CSS class instead of just regular class. And that will give us the ability to add in our jQuery UI stuff that we want to see on our sign-in button. So of course, that's going to post. When that posts, it goes to the login user. Method is execute. So that's going to be our main code, and that's going to be our struts action that we're coding here. Login user action. It extends the action support, and you'll note that it implements session aware and servlet response aware. Because of the cookie thing being a little bit tricky to work with, I've included the servlet response aware into this, which doesn't exactly line up with what we'd want to do. Ultimately, we want to try to avoid using servlets altogether. That's the purpose of using the struts, is to just sort of get away from the servlets altogether and work with the actions. But by doing this, I can actually use the response and request objects from a servlet if I use servlet request aware or servlet response aware. So I've decided to include the responses so that I can set cookies into the servlet container and have that stuff available to me. Session aware, of course, is going to allow me to integrate with the sessions. The nice thing about building an action is it'll work a lot like a bean. So we build out some private variables, and then once we actually post to the form or post to the action, now what we'll see is that those mappings will take place behind the scenes, and we don't have to do anything to pull in parameters, which is really sweet. So here we'll map our user ID and password directly to the form, just like we had before, except for now they're going to be set automatically through struts. And then we have our auth level, which will come in, our remember me, which will come in from those different variables that we've set on the form. And finally, the execute method, of course, is very important. That's what's going to execute when we run the code. But first, before we look at execute, let's look at one other thing. If you remember back, I mentioned that with struts, we have the ability to validate parameters. And so here we have a method called validate. What this is going to do is if we have parameters coming in through the posting to the action, it's going to make sure that they're the values that we expect them to be. So if the user ID is bad or if the password is bad, we can actually reject it. We add a field error, and as soon as we do that, the form knows that the field error exists and it will actually return back to the struts.xml file. If there's a problem with input, we're going to redirect back to login.jsp. If there's an actual error, we'll do the login error.jsp. And we can actually use the struts then to just redirect, and we don't have to do anything in our code to redirect. It takes care of it for us. Down here, we also have set session and set servlet response so that we can work with the incoming objects as well and be able to work against the session or the servlet response in our execute code. So then in our execute code, very quickly, all we do is essentially pull our DB manager. We get that from the application. Again, the action context now is going to be our main critical object that we're going to access. We're going to get the context from that and then get the application. And then we're going to essentially go through that map one by one and find the world DB manager, set that into our DB manager. If it's null, return the error. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and connect. If we can't connect, return the error. And then we'll pull in our web user manager model, and we'll use that to work against the DB to make sure that we have a valid web user, put that into session, otherwise return an error. If they added cookies, we can go ahead and do that just like we did before, and you can work with the cookie manager if you wanted to, but you'll need to have a set method added. And then finally, once everything works, let's return success. So let's go ahead and run this and see this in action. So we'll look at our index here and go ahead and just run it. And that will start up, and we'll see that we're welcome to the world manager just like before. Here's our login screen. You can see it's all styled for us and ready to go. So let's go ahead and log in as our admin, and we'll remember ourselves and sign in. And we can see we're there, and of course we can view our cities, view our countries, add a new city, etc. So we'll go ahead and sign out. We go back to our login page. Let's go ahead and leave one of these blank. Actually, let's leave them both blank and sign in. What you can see now is because of our struts, we actually have that input validation. It tells us the username is required, and it highlights the field for us, which is really nice. And it would be the same thing if the password was missing. And of course, once we have that, it will log us in. So that's some of the nice, handy things that we can do and see from using the Struts framework.